Hello, this is Andy Becker. I'm representing KLAW, Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers. We want to thank our fearless leader, Mark Miller, who couldn't be with us today, but has been doing these interviews dating back to 2016. And we want to thank BCAT, Bremerton Kitsap Access Television, for giving us this opportunity to present local writers and authors. Well, let's jump right into our special guest today. Today we have Don Pugnetti Jr. He's written a wonderful book that's getting so much buzz. It's called A Coat Dyed Black. What's it about, Jerry?
Well, first, Andy, I want to thank you for inviting me here, and BCAT for giving me this opportunity. So I really thank you. The book is about, it's set in Norway during World War II, and it takes a fictional character who's modeled after real people, a real person, and it takes them through the 5 years that Nazi Germany occupied Norway during World War II. It transforms this character into from a farmer working sun up, sun down on his family's homestead, and transforms him into a resistance fighter out to take Norway back from the Nazis.
So in World War II, what happened to Norway?
Well, it's an interesting saga, and it's an often overlooked piece of the story of World War II. At the beginning, at the outset, Norway was a peaceful country, a neutral country. They had declared their neutrality in World War I. They were confident they'd already declared their neutrality to remain neutral for this in 1940, this new outbreak, which would become World War II. But Adolf Hitler had other ideas, and he was concerned about the Allies taking over Norway and using it to control ship movements on the North Sea, plus iron ore was being mined in Sweden and taken by rail across and leaving a port in northern port in Norway, and he was and that fed the Nazi war machine, and Hitler was concerned that that would be blocked. So in April 9th, 1940, he invaded Norway, and the Norwegians put up a courageous fight, but they were ill-equipped and outmanned, and within 2 months after the April 1940 invasion, they surrendered. And of course, what followed was 5 years of oppression, tyranny, brutality, denial of freedoms, even basic necessities were ordinary Norwegians were found it impossible or very difficult to obtain. And under conditions like that, if history teaches us anything, it's that there will be a will to resist, and that's what happened.
So to summarize, Nazi Germany wanted the shipping lanes, and they wanted the resources, particularly the iron ore, for their war machine.
Correct.
And that's what caused the occupation.
Really, that's what caused to deny. Hitler was also concerned about the Allies coming through Norway across the southern section of the North Sea and landing on Germany's shores. But primarily it was to protect, to control those northern shipping lines.
So in Washington, for example, in Paulsbo, we have a lot of Norwegian heritage. As you've sold this book, and I know it's only been out a year, Are you meeting a lot of people with Norwegian heritage who gravitate to this book?
I have met a great number, just an incredible number of people with Norwegian heritages and love their Norwegian heritage. And this book has really resonated with so many of them in Paulsbo, but across the country. And it's been an absolutely incredible feeling to hear from people across the country, far and wide, about how this book has really prompted them to identify what their family members, whether it's an aunt or uncle or a great aunt or uncle or grandparents or parents, were involved in. And so many of those people that became immigrants after the war, and they were reluctant to talk about those war years, because of course it was about survival and it was very difficult. That has been really a wonderful experience, one of the greatest experiences, I think, of writing this book.
And I've found that a lot of people of my father's generation, for example, my father served in World War II and was a lieutenant, serving both in Italy and Northern Africa, specifically Morocco. Wow. That he was always reluctant to talk about his World War II experiences. I know you did a lot of research, first-person research, with people who participated in the Norwegian resistance. How did that come about? And tell us about how extensive your research was to put together this novel.
Well, thank you, Andy, for that. This book was indeed a long time coming, and I have to take you back to the mid-'70s. I was in the early part of my newspaper career and, frankly, early part of my marriage. In early conversations then with my father-in-law, he told me some stories about his involvement in World War II. He was a post-war Norwegian immigrant that frankly came to America to escape or seeking to escape the horrors of war. And those stories caused me to become quite interested in what happened in Norway, because I knew little about it. And so I accessed books at the library and started reading about it. It didn't take me long to realize that it was a story that needed to be told. And so I started recording him and interviewing him. And that followed with interviews from other family members, several trips to Norway where I interviewed family members there who were also involved, and a number of people outside the family who were also resistance fighters. And so it was about more than a decade of research that went into this book. But there was a difficulty I faced about the mid-'80s when one of the most notable issues was that these people would talk to me, but only under condition that they not be named. And you know, to a journalist, you can't use names, because I had set out to write a nonfiction book. And so I respected their condition, and I honored it. And it was based on the premise that what they did was no more important than what so many others did. And clearly there were many who gave their lives for the cause. And so while I honored it, it became an obstacle to me, and ultimately I was discouraged enough to shelve the project altogether. And so boxes of my research, they were in attics and basements as we kind of moved around here in the Puget Sound area. And then finally in 2017, would you believe, my father-in-law's mugshot appeared in a book that written in Norway about resistance activities, and there were 2 mugshots of him from Gestapo files, So that led to me being contacted by the author of the book, who wanted me to share, who heard about my research and wanted me to share it with him. And that rekindled my interest. I was retired then, and it rekindled my interest to write this book. And so that's how this thing came about, and I'm very proud of it. And it's so self-satisfying to actually complete this book.
In some sense, it sounds like it's almost a love letter to your father-in-law and to the other resistance fighters of Norway who fought against the Nazis at great risk, at great peril. And as we see in the novel, the protagonist actually gets caught, gets brutalized in prison, gets brutalized in interrogations. Was that your father-in-law's experience, if you're able to say?
I can say that, yes, it was. And much of the book, as I had mentioned earlier, is based on his experiences, but the character is the main character, Björn, is molded from, I'd say, I'm guessing about 2.5 characters, but my father-in-law plays a large part of it. And I think your point really leads me to tell you that it's one of my greatest, I think, parts of self-satisfaction about this book is that way back when, I had the presence of mind to capture these stories of these courageous people before they passed on, and that I had the gumption and the joy of writing this book so those stories could be told.
And you've had a long history as a journalist, the longest of which you were a newspaper guy for the Tacoma News-Tribune. So my question is, was it hard to go from nonfiction, from journalism, who, what, when, where, why, and often not the why, to go and translate to a fictional area? And I assume that was something totally new to you.
You know, it was, and it's such a relevant question because I asked that very question so many times. You know, can I should say, can I write a fictional book? And you know, in journalism, you stick to the facts, but I think in retirement, I reached a point where, you know, I thought that I was a little more wizened in the genres of writing, and so I really thought I could do it. But what was important to me is that while the story's fictional and the characters are fictional, and I wanted to tell a compelling story, a page-turning story was my goal. But at the same time, the characters are based on real people. I based them on real people. The experiences that they had are based on real experienced, true events. And then the important thing to me, Andy, and was to the framework of what happened in Norway is accurate to history. So the context, I wanted to both entertain and educate people on what happened in Norway during World War II.
And part of the page-turning part of this story is your protagonist, Bjorn, has rekindled a romance with a contemporary who's he's very attracted to, who's also part of the resistance. And not to tell the story, but it's elements like that you added out of whole cloth, because the 2.5 characters, including your father-in-law, that never happened, correct?
That's correct. That was totally out of my gourd, and because I think the last thing that I would do is talk about any romances that my father-in-law had. So and furthermore, if I did that, I think my in-house editor would have something to.
Well, I can't imagine your father-in-law would have shared his romances during that time period with you.
Yes, that's correct.
But I was interested in that part of the story and the extent to which you felt, as you constructed this fictional part of the book, how much you felt the war added to that romance of the characters, and then how much the war was detrimental to the romance.
You know, it was that was important for me, and without creating spoilers, and I'd admonish you not to give any spoilers.
Yeah, I don't want to give it away.
But I did, through that romance, I did want to show that what the cost of the war, you know, and you know, it's virtually every page you can see a cost of the war, but I wanted to, you know, basically show that, you know, there were this war created two tortured souls, and you know, among others, and so I appreciate you saying that, because that was an intent. And plus, every novel needs to have a romance. I mean, you got to have a romance, you know. And
indeed, this book does.
Yes, yeah, tasteful romance.
In your research, what did you discover about the post-war Norway? Because weren't there indeed a lot of collaborators with the Nazis, and didn't Norway have its own version of a Nazi party at that time?
Yes, it did, and it was called the National Samling, and it was a fascist party that really was in bed with the Nazis and became the Nazi party effectively, and the Nazi Germany authorities gave it considerable power, and it was frankly as ruthless to its own, you know, members of that party were as ruthless to their own Norwegians as the Nazi Germany ever was. And at the end of the war, there were 90,000 Nazi sympathizers that faced the music in some form. The leader, by the way, was a man by the name of Vidkun Quisling, and his last name became really synonymous with the word traitor, and so I'm sure that many of the viewers have heard that word Quisling. You know, and he was executed. He was put on trial and executed. There were several other, and maybe a dozen or so, I believe, Norwegian Nazi sympathizers that were executed, but there were prison sentence and fines, and so there was a lot of justice. But you know, the interesting thing is that you know, Nazism in Norway, like other countries, didn't die. You know, didn't die out. It still existed, but it moved into the shadows, and there were considerable retribution post-war for those sympathizers.
Going to current events, is there a resurgence now in anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic resurgence with some of those people?
Well, I haven't seen it emerge. I'm not really versed on that, but I haven't seen it resurface in Norway, and but I'm sure certainly we've seen it. It's prevalent, and it exists, and I can tell you this: it's a dangerous predicament, and it's a ideology that, in my opinion, needs to be stamped out.
Absolutely. Now we're coming to the end of our interview. So I would be remiss with our viewership if I didn't have you comment on the author is Pugnetti. That does not sound Norwegian to me. It sounds very Italian to me. Are you an honorary Norwegian? How did an Italian guy, in other words, end up becoming so versed with Norwegian history enough to write this beautiful book?
You know, and thank you. It's really based on love. My wife, you know, her father, actually her second dad, her birth father died when she was young, and her mom remarried this Norwegian immigrant who raised her, and the love was strong, and so I'm really writing her coattails. But I'm proud to tell you and all the viewers that I am a full-fledged member of the Paulsbo Sons of Norway Lodge. They even let, you know, and that's a big issue, is where somebody with a vowel at the end of his name could write a book about Norway. But of course, you know, it was the stories that really pulled me in. So I can even speak Norwegian, Andy. You know, I can speak a little bit of Norwegian, have difficulty understanding, but and blend that with some of the studies I did with Italian. So I really mix up the words.
Well, that's fantastic. Don Pugnetti Jr., A Coat Dyed Black. Final question.
Yes.
Where did the title come from?
The title came from, and you'll have to read the book fully to understand its significance, but there really was a coat dyed black. So it was a military coat that my father-in-law had. I think in reality, he got it from his dad, and he liked to use it on the farm because it had lots of pockets, kept him warm. But you know, when the Nazis invade, last thing you want to do is be wearing a military coat. So he dyed it to give it a more civilian look.
He loved his coat.
Yes, he did. He did.
Don Pugnetti Jr., thank you so much for sharing this story with the world and appearing here locally. Thank you to KLAW, Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers, and thank you again to BCAT, Bremerton Kitsap Access Television. I hope you enjoyed today's interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for this opportunity.